Mom's best friend turned out to be a delusional stalker who thought Dad was in love with her. She harassed our family for years, spread rumors around town, and finally snapped when she realized Dad would never leave Mom for her. I'm a 22-year-old woman and this whole situation started years ago, but I only recently discovered how deep it goes. First, let me give you some background about my family. My parents are Maria, 49F, and Robert, 51M. They've been married for 28 years and have 4 kids, me and my 3 younger brothers who are 20, 18, and 16. My mom works as a high school principal and my dad is a regional manager for a large construction company. We're not rich but we're comfortable. Dad makes good money and we live in a nice neighborhood. Mom loves posting pictures of our family vacations and achievements on social media. She's proud of what they've built together. My parents are both really good looking for their age. Mom stayed in great shape and Dad still gets attention from women when we go out. He's tall, has salt and pepper hair, and works out regularly. People always comment on how young they both look. Dad wanted more kids after me, especially another daughter, but Mom had complications during my youngest brother's birth so they stopped. The problem is my mom's best friend Sandra, 43F. Mom met her about 6 years ago when Sandra moved to our town for a new job at the local community college. She teaches English there. Sandra was going through a divorce and didn't know anyone, so Mom invited her to family barbecues and holiday parties. Mom felt sorry for her and wanted to help her settle in. From the beginning, something felt off about Sandra. During family gatherings, she barely talked to me or my brothers. She wasn't interested in getting to know any of us kids. But she always found reasons to talk to Dad. She'd ask him about his work, compliment his grilling skills, or ask him to help her with something around her house. At first, I thought she was just being friendly. Then I started noticing patterns. Sandra would show up at our house when Mom wasn't home, claiming she forgot Mom was at work. She'd ask Dad if she could wait inside. She'd dress differently when she came over, tighter clothes, more makeup. When Mom was around, Sandra dressed normally. She also started asking me questions about Dad's schedule, his hobbies, what kind of music he liked. She said she wanted to get him a nice birthday gift, but the questions seemed too personal. The weird behavior escalated about 3 years ago. Sandra started showing up at Dad's work sites. She'd claim she was just driving by and saw his company truck. She'd bring him coffee or lunch. Dad mentioned it to Mom, saying it was nice but unnecessary. Mom thought it was sweet that Sandra was being thoughtful. Sandra also became obsessed with our family photos on Mom's Facebook. She'd comment on every single picture of Dad. If Mom posted a photo of the whole family, Sandra would comment specifically about how handsome Dad looked or how lucky Mom was. She'd share the post to her own page with captions about family goals and finding the right man. I have a part-time job at a local coffee shop where Sandra comes regularly. She always asks me about Dad when she orders. She wants to know if he's stressed at work, if he's happy at home, if Mom treats him well. She frames these questions like she's concerned about our family, but they made me uncomfortable. I started giving her short answers. Last year, things got stranger. Sandra began having car trouble every few weeks. She'd call Dad instead of a mechanic or roadside assistance. Dad would go help her because that's the kind of person he is. These incidents always happened when Mom was busy with work or out of town visiting her sister. Sandra would thank Dad by cooking elaborate meals and inviting our family over. She'd spend the whole evening focusing on Dad, asking his opinion on everything and ignoring the rest of us. Mom started working longer hours this school year because of budget cuts at her school. She has to stay late for meetings and weekend events. Sandra began using this time to her advantage. She'd text Dad directly instead of going through Mom. She'd ask him to help with yard work, moving furniture, or fixing things around her house. Dad would help because he's helpful by nature, but he started mentioning these requests to Mom afterward. Sandra also started dressing like Mom. She changed her hair color to match Mom's shade of brown. She started wearing similar clothes and jewelry. When Mom bought a new car, Sandra bought the same model in a different color within a month. Mom thought it was coincidental, but I found it creepy. The situation reached a new level 2 months ago. I work at the coffee shop on weekends, and Sandra comes in every Saturday morning. She always orders the same drink and sits at the corner table with her laptop. Last month, she started making phone calls while she was there. I couldn't help overhearing because she talks loudly. She was talking to someone about Dad. She mentioned his name, described his appearance, and talked about his job. She said she'd been patient for years but was ready to make her move. She talked about how Mom was always busy and didn't appreciate what she had. She said Dad deserved someone who would focus on him completely. I thought about telling Mom, but I needed more proof. So I started paying closer attention. I noticed Sandra had started parking near Dad's work sites again. She'd sit in her car and watch him. She began shopping at the grocery store where Mom shops, hoping to run into Dad. She joined the gym where Dad works out, even though she'd never shown interest in fitness before. 3 weeks ago, my cousin Lisa, 25F, who works at the community college called me. She said she needed to tell me something about Sandra. Lisa works in the administration office and handles personnel files. She said Sandra had been asking HR about Dad's company, claiming she was interested in hiring them for a project. But when HR asked for details, Sandra couldn't provide any specifics. Lisa also told me that Sandra had been using the college computers to look up information about Dad's company and his personal social media accounts. This violates the college's computer usage policy. Lisa said she'd been documenting these incidents because she was concerned about Sandra's behavior. Then last week, everything came to a head. Mom was at a weekend conference for school principals. Dad was home with my brothers while I was working. Sandra showed up at our house around dinner time. She brought a casserole and wine. She told Dad she thought he might be lonely with Mom away and wanted to keep him company. My youngest brother texted me from upstairs. He said Sandra was acting weird. She was sitting too close to Dad on the couch and kept touching his arm while they talked. She was asking personal questions about his marriage and whether he ever thought about what life would be like with someone else. Dad was giving short answers and trying to change the subject. When I got home from work, Sandra was still there. She was in the kitchen washing dishes and acting like she lived there. She'd changed into one of Mom's aprons that was hanging by the sink. When she saw me, she quickly took it off. Dad was in the living room watching TV with my brothers, but he looked uncomfortable. Sandra left soon after I arrived, but not before hugging Dad goodbye and telling him to call her if he needed anything while Mom was away. After she left, Dad said the visit felt strange, but he didn't want to be rude since she's Mom's friend. I called Lisa the next day and asked her to keep monitoring Sandra's computer usage at work. I also started documenting everything I noticed about Sandra's behavior. I took photos when I saw her car parked near Dad's work sites. I saved screenshots of her social media comments on our family photos. Yesterday, Lisa called with disturbing news. Sandra had used the college computer to research divorce lawyers in our area. She'd also looked up information about Dad's income and property records. Lisa said this was the final straw and she was going to report Sandra to the college administration. But here's what really scared me. Lisa said Sandra had been telling her coworkers that she was in a relationship with a married man who was planning to leave his wife for her. She described this man in detail, and the description matched Dad perfectly. Sandra was telling people at work that she was going to be a stepmother to 4 children soon. I haven't told Mom or Dad about any of this yet. Mom trusts Sandra completely and always defends her when I've made small comments about her behavior. Dad is oblivious to what's really happening. He sees Sandra's attention as friendly concern from Mom's best friend. I'm scared about what Sandra might do next. She's becoming bolder and more desperate. I think she genuinely believes Dad is interested in her, even though he's never given her any encouragement. She's created this fantasy relationship in her head and now she's trying to make it real. I need advice on how to handle this situation. Should I tell Mom everything I know? Should I talk to Dad first? Should I confront Sandra directly? I'm worried that if I say something without enough proof, it will cause problems between my parents. But I'm also worried that if I don't say something soon, Sandra is going to do something that damages our family permanently. Has anyone else dealt with a situation like this? How do you protect your family from someone who's supposed to be a friend? Update 1: I need to update everyone on what happened after my original post. Thank you to everyone who gave me advice. Most of you said I should tell my parents immediately, and you were right. I decided to talk to Dad first. I waited until Mom was at work and my brothers were at school. I sat him down and told him I was worried about Sandra's behavior. I explained everything I'd noticed over the past few years and showed him the evidence I'd collected. Dad's reaction surprised me. He didn't seem shocked. He was quiet for a long time, then he told me he'd been having his own concerns about Sandra but didn't want to worry Mom or seem paranoid. He said Sandra had been texting him more frequently in recent weeks. She was sending good morning and good night messages, asking about his day, and sharing personal details about her life. She'd started calling him by a nickname that only Mom usually used. When he didn't respond quickly, she'd send follow-up messages asking if everything was okay. Dad also told me about an incident that happened 2 weeks ago that he hadn't mentioned to Mom. Sandra had shown up at his work site claiming her car wouldn't start. She asked him to drive her home. During the drive, she started crying and saying she was lonely. She told him she thought about him often and felt like he understood her better than anyone else. Dad said he felt trapped in the car and didn't know how to respond. When they got to her house, Sandra invited him in for coffee. He declined, but she grabbed his hand and said she needed to show him something important. He pulled away and said he had to get back to work. Sandra got upset and accused him of being cold. She said she thought they had a special connection. Dad said he'd been avoiding Sandra's calls since then, but she kept trying. She'd started showing up at our house when she knew Mom wasn't home. Dad had been making excuses not to answer the door, but he couldn't avoid her forever. After hearing all this, I knew we had to tell Mom together. Dad agreed. We called Mom at work and asked her to come home for lunch. When she arrived, we sat her down and explained everything. Mom's reaction was not what I expected. She didn't seem surprised either. She was quiet for a while, then she said she'd been noticing changes in Sandra's behavior too but had been trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Mom said Sandra had been asking strange questions about their marriage lately. She wanted to know if mom and dad were happy, if they ever fought, if mom thought dad was satisfied with his life. Sandra had also been making comments about how hard it must be for mom to balance work and family, and how dad probably felt neglected. Mom also revealed that Sandra had been calling her at work more often, always wanting to know dad's schedule. She'd ask what time he got home, when he left for work, if he was traveling for business. Mom thought Sandra was being thoughtful and wanted to coordinate visits, but now she realized Sandra was gathering information. The three of us decided we needed to confront Sandra together. We didn't want to involve my brothers yet because we hoped we could handle this quietly. We planned to meet with Sandra that weekend and make it clear that her behavior was inappropriate. But Sandra forced our hand before we could arrange the meeting. 2 days after our family conversation, she showed up at our house on Thursday evening. Mom was at a school board meeting, and dad was helping my middle brother with a science project. I was in my room doing homework. I heard the doorbell and went downstairs. Sandra was standing on our porch holding a bottle of wine and a gift bag. She was dressed up more than usual. She asked where mom was, and I told her about the meeting. Sandra smiled and said that was perfect because she wanted to talk to dad privately. I let her in because I didn't know what else to do, but I stayed in the living room instead of going back to my room. Sandra called for dad, and when he came downstairs, she handed him the wine and gift bag. She said she wanted to celebrate their friendship and show her appreciation for everything he'd done for her. Dad looked uncomfortable and set the gifts aside without opening them. Sandra sat down on the couch and patted the cushion next to her, indicating dad should sit there. He chose a chair across the room instead. Sandra started talking about how grateful she was for dad's help and support. She said she'd been thinking about their friendship and realized it meant more to her than any relationship she'd ever had. She said she felt like dad really understood her and cared about her happiness. Dad tried to redirect the conversation. He mentioned that mom would be home soon and suggested Sandra call her to arrange a better time to visit. Sandra said she didn't want to talk to mom. She wanted to focus on dad. Then Sandra said something that made me step forward. She told dad she knew he was unhappy in his marriage. She said she could tell mom didn't appreciate him and was too busy with work to give him the attention he deserved. She said she'd been watching their relationship and could see that dad needed someone who would prioritize him. Dad stood up and told Sandra she was wrong about his marriage and that her comments were inappropriate. He said mom was the most important person in his life and he was completely happy with their relationship. Sandra also stood up and moved closer to dad. She said she didn't believe him. She said she'd seen how he looked at her and how he responded to her attention. She said she knew he felt the same connection she did. Dad stepped back and told Sandra she was mistaken. He said he'd been helpful to her as mom's friend, but there was nothing romantic between them. He asked her to leave. Sandra's whole demeanor changed. She started crying and said dad was lying to himself. She said she'd been patient for years, waiting for him to realize they belonged together. She said she'd done everything she could to show him how perfect they would be as a couple. Then Sandra said something that made my blood run cold. She said she knew dad had always wanted another daughter and that she could give him that. She said they could start their own family together and he could have everything he'd ever wanted. Dad told Sandra to leave immediately. He said her behavior was completely unacceptable and that she needed to stay away from our family. Sandra refused to leave. She said she wasn't going anywhere until dad admitted his feelings for her. I was recording this whole conversation on my phone. I'd started recording when Sandra began talking about dad being unhappy in his marriage. I knew we might need evidence of what she was saying. Dad called mom and told her to come home immediately. He said there was an emergency with Sandra. Mom said she'd leave the meeting right away. While we waited for mom, Sandra continued pleading with dad. She said she'd given up other relationships for him. She said she'd moved to our town specifically to be near him after seeing his photo on mom's social media. She said she'd planned everything carefully and couldn't understand why he was rejecting her. When mom arrived 20 minutes later, Sandra was still in our living room. She was sitting on the couch crying and begging dad to give her a chance. Dad was standing by the front door, clearly wanting Sandra to leave. Mom walked in and immediately asked what was happening. Sandra looked up at mom and said she was sorry but she couldn't pretend anymore. She said she was in love with dad and believed he felt the same way about her. Mom stood there for a moment, then she told Sandra to get out of her house and never come back. Sandra started protesting, saying mom didn't understand. She said dad had been unhappy for years and deserved someone who would worship him the way she did. Mom grabbed Sandra's purse and the gifts she'd brought and walked to the front door. She told Sandra she had 10 seconds to leave or she was calling the police. Sandra finally left, but not before shouting that this wasn't over and that dad would eventually realize what he was missing. After Sandra left, mom locked the door and turned to dad and me. She asked to see the recording I'd made. We listened to it together, and mom's face got harder with each word Sandra had said. Mom called the police that night and filed a report. The officer said Sandra's behavior constituted harassment and possibly stalking. He said we should document any future contact from Sandra and call them immediately if she showed up again. Dad has blocked Sandra's number and social media accounts. Mom did the same. We've told my brothers what happened, and they're all angry and protective. My youngest brother said he'd always thought Sandra was creepy and was glad she was finally gone. But I don't think this is over. Yesterday, I saw Sandra's car parked across the street from our house. When I looked out the window again an hour later, she was gone. I'm worried about what she might do next. Update 2: Sandra escalated everything after my last update. The situation got much worse before it got better. The day after Mom filed the police report, Sandra started calling Mom's work phone. She called the school office repeatedly, demanding to speak with Mom. When the secretary said Mom was unavailable, Sandra claimed there was a family emergency. The secretary eventually told Sandra that Mom had instructed her not to take any calls from Sandra. Sandra then started showing up at Mom's school. She would park in the visitor parking lot and wait for Mom to come outside. The first time this happened, Mom saw Sandra's car and called the police from inside the building. The officer who responded told Sandra she needed to leave school property immediately. 2 days later, Sandra tried a different approach. She submitted a formal complaint to the school district about Mom's job performance. In the complaint, Sandra claimed Mom was having personal problems that were affecting her work. She said Mom was distracted and emotional during school events. The complaint was completely false, but the district had to investigate it. Mom's supervisor called her into a meeting to discuss Sandra's complaint. Mom explained the situation and showed the supervisor copies of the police report and the recording I'd made. The supervisor was understanding and said they would handle Sandra's complaint appropriately. But Mom was embarrassed and stressed about having her personal life scrutinized at work. Meanwhile, Sandra kept trying to contact Dad. She couldn't call or text him directly because he blocked her numbers, but she found other ways. She started calling Dad's work office and leaving messages with his secretary. She told the secretary she was a family friend with important information about a family emergency. Dad's secretary gave him the messages, but Dad never returned the calls. Sandra also began following Dad to work sites. Dad would arrive at a construction site and see Sandra's car parked nearby. She would sit in her car watching him work. When Dad told his crew about the situation, they started taking photos of Sandra's car and license plate as evidence. One morning, Sandra approached Dad while he was inspecting a job site. She acted like nothing had happened at our house. She said she missed talking to him and wanted to apologize for any misunderstanding. She said she'd been emotional that night and hadn't expressed herself clearly. Dad told Sandra to stay away from him and his family. He said her behavior was harassment and that he would call the police if she contacted him again. Sandra started crying and said she just wanted to be friends like before. Dad walked away and called Mom to report the incident. Things took a darker turn 3 weeks ago. Sandra started spreading rumors about our family around town. She told people at the grocery store and gas station that Mom and Dad were getting divorced. She said Dad was looking for a new place to live and that Mom was having an affair with someone at work. These rumors reached Mom's coworkers and some of our neighbors. Mom started getting concerned phone calls from friends asking if everything was okay at home. Mom had to explain the real situation to several people, which was humiliating for her. Sandra also started posting cryptic messages on social media about being betrayed by people she trusted. She posted quotes about toxic friendships and ungrateful people. She shared articles about women who steal other women's husbands and men who lead women on. Her posts were clearly directed at our family, even though she didn't mention us by name. My cousin Lisa called me with updates about Sandra's behavior at work. Lisa said Sandra had been absent from work frequently and seemed distracted when she was there. Sandra's students were complaining that she wasn't prepared for class and seemed confused about assignments. The college administration was starting to notice problems with Sandra's job performance. Lisa also said Sandra had been using her work computer to research our family online. She'd been looking up our home address, Dad's business information, and even my brother's school records. This violated the college's computer usage policy, and Lisa was documenting everything for her supervisor. 2 weeks ago, Sandra's behavior became more concerning. She started leaving gifts at our house when we weren't home. We would come back to find flowers, cards, or food on our front porch. The gifts were always addressed to Dad with notes apologizing for the misunderstanding and begging for another chance. One of the notes said Sandra had been seeing a counselor who told her she needed to fight for what she wanted. Another note said Sandra had realized she couldn't live without Dad and was willing to wait as long as necessary for him to change his mind. Dad started taking photos of all the gifts before throwing them away. Mom called the police each time, but the officer said leaving gifts wasn't technically illegal unless Sandra was trespassing on our property to deliver them. Last week, Sandra crossed a line that finally got her in serious trouble. She showed up at my youngest brother's high school during his lunch break. She told the office she was his aunt and needed to speak with him about a family emergency. The school office called Mom to verify Sandra's identity before releasing my brother from class. Mom immediately told them Sandra was not a family member and was not authorized to have any contact with any of her children. The school called the police and detained Sandra until officers arrived. Sandra was arrested for attempting to make unauthorized contact with a minor at school. She spent the night in jail and was released the next morning on bail. The incident was reported to the college where she works. The college suspended Sandra pending an investigation into her behavior. Lisa said Sandra's supervisor had received multiple complaints about her job performance and personal conduct. The combination of work problems and the arrest was enough to trigger a formal review of her employment. Sandra tried to contact Dad one more time after her arrest. She called his work office from jail and left a message saying the whole situation was a misunderstanding. She said she'd only gone to the school to apologize to our family through my brother. She said she hoped Dad would visit her or at least call her back. Dad saved the voicemail and gave it to the police as additional evidence. The officer said Sandra's continued attempts to contact our family violated the conditions of her bail. They issued a restraining order requiring Sandra to stay at least 500 feet away from our house, our workplaces, and my brother's schools. Yesterday, Lisa called with more news. The college fired Sandra for violating multiple workplace policies and bringing negative attention to the institution. Sandra's computer usage logs showed she'd spent hours during work time researching our family and looking up information unrelated to her job. Her recent absences and poor teaching performance were also factors in the decision. Lisa said Sandra cleaned out her office yesterday afternoon. She was escorted off campus by security and told not to return. Several coworkers said Sandra was crying and mumbling about how unfair everyone was being to her. I thought Sandra being fired would end everything, but I was wrong. This morning, Mom got a call from Sandra's landlord. The landlord said Sandra had given notice that she was moving out of her apartment at the end of the month. She told the landlord she was relocating to be closer to someone important to her. We don't know where Sandra is planning to move, but we're worried she might try to follow our family or continue harassing us from a new location. Dad has contacted his company's security team to make sure Sandra can't access any of his work sites. Mom has informed her school's administration about the restraining order. The whole experience has been exhausting for our family. Mom has been having trouble sleeping and seems more worried than she lets on. Dad feels guilty that his helpfulness toward Sandra led to this situation. My brothers are angry and protective, especially after Sandra tried to involve the youngest one. We're hoping that losing her job and facing legal consequences will finally make Sandra realize she needs to leave us alone. But based on her behavior so far, I'm not sure she's capable of accepting reality. We're all staying alert and documenting everything in case she tries to contact us again. Update 3. This is my final update on the Sandra situation. A lot has happened since my last post, and I think our family can finally put this nightmare behind us. Sandra did not give up after losing her job. In fact, losing her job seemed to make her more desperate and reckless. Since she no longer had work obligations, she had more time to focus on harassing our family. 3 days after Sandra was fired, she violated the restraining order. Mom was leaving the grocery store when she saw Sandra sitting in her car in the parking lot. Mom immediately called the police and drove straight to the police station instead of going home. Sandra followed Mom's car but turned around when she saw where Mom was going. The police arrested Sandra later that day at her apartment. She spent 3 days in jail for violating the restraining order. When she was released, the judge extended the restraining order and warned Sandra that any future violations would result in longer jail time. Sandra's response was to hire a lawyer and try to fight the restraining order. She claimed our family was harassing her and that Dad had led her on. Her lawyer submitted a motion claiming Sandra was the victim of a conspiracy to destroy her reputation and career. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Dad, Mom, and I had to testify about Sandra's behavior. I brought all the evidence I'd collected, including photos, recordings, and documentation of Sandra's visits to our house and Dad's work sites. Sandra's testimony was disturbing. She insisted that Dad had been flirting with her and encouraging her attention. She said Dad had complained to her about being unhappy in his marriage and had asked for her advice about his problems. She claimed Dad had invited her to family gatherings specifically to spend time with her. Sandra also said Mom was jealous and controlling. She claimed Mom had turned the whole family against her because she was afraid of losing Dad. Sandra said she was only trying to be a good friend and that our family had misinterpreted her actions. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including the recording I'd made and the documentation from Dad's workplace about Sandra's stalking behavior. He denied Sandra's motion and made the restraining order permanent. He also ordered Sandra to undergo a psychological evaluation. Sandra's behavior became more erratic after losing the court case. She started posting detailed messages on social media about our family. She shared our home address, Dad's work information, and even photos she'd taken of our house and Dad's work sites. She claimed we were persecuting her for falling in love and that she was the real victim. Mom's friends and co-workers started seeing Sandra's posts and calling to check on our family. Some of Sandra's posts contained veiled threats about not giving up and making sure the truth came out. Mom took screenshots of everything and reported it to the police. The police said Sandra's social media posts constituted cyberbullying and harassment. They contacted Sandra and warned her to remove the posts and stop mentioning our family online. Sandra initially refused, claiming she had the right to tell her side of the story. 2 weeks later, Sandra's landlord called Mom again. He said Sandra had been evicted for not paying rent and for causing disturbances in the building. Other tenants had complained about Sandra talking loudly on the phone at all hours and having emotional outbursts in the hallways. The landlord said Sandra had been telling neighbors that she was being persecuted by a local family who was trying to destroy her life. She was asking other tenants if they knew anything about our family and showing them photos of Dad from social media. We thought Sandra might finally leave town after being evicted, but she didn't. Instead, she moved into a cheap motel about 10 miles from our house. She started driving by our house more frequently, sometimes several times a day. Our neighbors began recognizing her car and would call us when they saw her. One afternoon, Sandra parked across the street from our house and sat there for over an hour. She was taking photos of our house with her phone. Dad called the police, and when the officer arrived, Sandra claimed she was visiting friends in the neighborhood and had every right to be on a public street. The officer explained that given the restraining order, Sandra needed to stay away from our street entirely. He escorted her off our block and warned her not to return. Sandra argued with the officer and said the restraining order was unfair, but she eventually drove away. The next week, Sandra tried a different approach. She started contacting Dad's clients and coworkers, claiming she had important information about him. She called several of Dad's business contacts and said Dad was involved in unethical practices and that she had evidence they needed to see. Dad's boss called him to ask about the strange phone calls his office had been receiving. Dad explained the whole situation and provided copies of the court documents and police reports. His boss was understanding and supportive, but Dad was embarrassed that his personal problems were affecting his professional relationships. Sandra also tried to contact my brothers at their schools. She couldn't get access to them directly because of the restraining order, but she started calling the school offices claiming to be a family friend with important information. The schools had already been notified about Sandra, so they didn't take her calls seriously. The turning point came 6 weeks ago when Sandra made a critical mistake. She was arrested for drunk driving while parked outside our house at 2 a.m. The police found her passed out in her car with the engine running. She had been drinking heavily and had a collection of photos of our family spread across her dashboard. When the police searched Sandra's car, they found disturbing evidence of her obsession. She had printed copies of all our social media photos and had drawn hearts around Dad's face in many of them. She had a notebook filled with detailed notes about our family schedule and routines. She had maps showing routes between our house, Dad's work sites, and the schools. Most concerning was a letter Sandra had written to Dad but never sent. In the letter, she said she couldn't live without him and that if she couldn't have him, she would make sure no one could. The letter talked about how unfair it was that Mom got to have the life Sandra deserved. The police arrested Sandra for drunk driving, violating the restraining order, and making terroristic threats. The prosecutor said the letter and other evidence showed Sandra posed a genuine danger to our family. They asked for Sandra to be held without bail until her trial. During the bail hearing, Sandra's own lawyer seemed disturbed by her behavior. He told the judge that Sandra had been difficult to work with and seemed unable to accept reality about the situation. The judge denied bail and ordered Sandra to undergo immediate psychiatric evaluation. Sandra has been in jail for 6 weeks now awaiting trial. The psychiatric evaluation determined that she has severe delusional disorder and requires long-term treatment. Her lawyer is negotiating a plea deal that would require Sandra to serve time in prison followed by mandatory psychiatric treatment. More importantly for our family, Sandra's sister contacted Mom last week. She said she was horrified by Sandra's behavior and wanted to apologize on behalf of their family. She explained that Sandra had always had problems with obsessive behavior and unrealistic expectations in relationships. Sandra's sister said their family had tried to get Sandra help years ago, but she had always refused treatment and cut contact with family members who suggested she had problems. She said Sandra's move to our town had been part of a pattern of starting over in new places when her behavior caused problems. The sister also revealed that Sandra had been fired from her previous job for inappropriate behavior toward a married coworker. She said Sandra had a history of becoming obsessed with unavailable men and creating fantasy relationships in her mind. This information helped us understand that nothing our family did caused Sandra's behavior. She was a disturbed person who would have targeted any family that fit her fantasy of the perfect life she wanted. The prosecutor expects Sandra will be sentenced to at least 2 years in prison followed by mandatory psychiatric treatment and probation. She will also be required to have no contact with our family for at least 10 years. Our family is finally starting to feel safe again. Dad has returned to his normal work routine without constantly looking over his shoulder. Mom is sleeping better and seems less anxious. My brothers have stopped asking if Sandra is gone for good. We learned a lot from this experience about trusting our instincts and taking action when someone's behavior seems wrong. We also learned how important it is to document everything and work with law enforcement when dealing with someone who won't respect boundaries. I still think about how different things might have been if we had confronted Sandra earlier or if Mom hadn't been so trusting. But our family survived this ordeal and we're stronger for having gone through it together. Sandra is where she belongs now, getting the help she needs while staying away from the family she terrorized. We don't expect to hear from her again, and we're looking forward to moving on with our lives without the constant worry of what she might do next. Now let's move to the next story. Story 2. I got into a relationship, got to know that my boyfriend has and realized that he won't be able to give me satisfaction. Broke up with him after one night stand with my ex. I, 28F, never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, struggling with a dilemma that's been weighing on me for weeks. It all started when I met Josh, 32M, at a friend's barbecue last month. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of indie films and obscure 80s music. As we talked, I found myself drawn to his warm smile and kind eyes. Josh and I exchanged numbers that day and started texting regularly. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, covering everything from our favorite books to our dreams for the future. After a week of chatting, he asked me out on a proper date. I was excited but also a bit nervous. It had been a while since I'd put myself out there romantically. Our first date was at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown. Josh arrived with flowers and pulled out my chair, such a gentleman. Throughout dinner, he was attentive and engaging. We talked for hours, losing track of time as we shared stories about our lives. I learned that Josh worked as an architect and volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends. His passion for both his career and giving back to the community was really attractive to me. As the weeks went by, Josh and I continued seeing each other regularly. He planned thoughtful dates like picnics in the park and visits to art galleries. I appreciated how he always made an effort to do things I enjoyed. Josh was unfailingly kind and supportive, especially when I opened up about some of my past relationship struggles. He listened without judgment and offered words of encouragement. The more time we spent together, the more I enjoyed Josh's company and personality. He had a great sense of humor and always knew how to make me laugh after a long day. I loved how passionate he got when talking about architecture or animal welfare. His enthusiasm was contagious. However, I couldn't ignore the fact that I wasn't particularly physically attracted to Joshua. He wasn't conventionally handsome, and there wasn't much of a spark when we touched or kissed. I tried to tell myself that looks weren't everything and that his wonderful personality more than made up for it. After all, I'd dated hot guys in the past who turned out to be jerks. Maybe this was a sign I needed to focus on what really mattered in a partner. About a month into dating, Josh and I went out for drinks one evening. We both had a few cocktails and were feeling relaxed. As we walked back to my apartment, he pulled me close and kissed me deeply. It was the first time we'd really made out, and I have to admit it felt a bit awkward. There wasn't much chemistry, but I chalked it up to nerves and kept going with it. When we got to my place, things started heating up. As we were kissing on the couch, Josh suddenly pulled back. He looked uncomfortable and said he needed to tell me something. My mind raced, wondering what it could be. Josh took a deep breath and explained that he dealt with erectile dysfunction. He assured me it wasn't a big deal, he just needed to take medication and he'd be fine next time. I was caught off guard but tried to be understanding. I told Josh I appreciated his honesty and that it didn't change how I felt about him. Inside, though, I felt conflicted. On one hand, I admired his vulnerability in sharing this with me. On the other, I worried about what it might mean for our physical relationship going forward. The next week, Josh came over to my place for dinner and a movie. We both knew sex was probably on the table this time. I was nervous but also curious to see how things would go. As we started kissing and touching, I noticed Josh seemed tense. When clothes started coming off, it became clear he was having trouble getting and staying aroused. What followed was honestly one of the most awkward sexual encounters of my life. Josh couldn't maintain an erection, even though he said he'd taken his medication. He seemed frustrated and embarrassed. I tried to be encouraging, but nothing seemed to help. After a while, we both gave up. The relief was palpable. In the days since, I've been grappling with how to move forward. Josh is truly a wonderful guy in so many ways. He's kind, supportive, and we have a great connection. But the lack of sexual chemistry is hard to ignore. I worry about committing to a relationship where physical intimacy might always be a struggle. To complicate things further, Josh opened up to me about how his last relationship ended because of his ED issues. Apparently his ex-girlfriend ended up cheating on him, claiming she needed sex. Part of me understands her frustration, even though I'd never condone cheating. I'm at a loss for what to do. Is it shallow to consider ending things over this? Should I give it more time? I care about Josh and don't want to hurt him, but I also have needs and desires in a relationship. Any advice on how to navigate this situation would be greatly appreciated. I'm really struggling with what the right thing to do is here. Update 1. It's been a few weeks since my last post, and I wanted to provide an update on the situation with Joshua. After much deliberation, I decided to have an open and honest conversation with him about my concerns regarding our physical intimacy. I knew it wouldn't be an easy talk, but I felt it was necessary for both of us. I invited Josh over to my place one evening, making sure we had plenty of time and privacy to discuss things. When he arrived, I could tell he sensed something was up. We sat down on the couch, and I took a deep breath before diving in. I started by telling Josh how much I valued our connection and enjoyed spending time with him. I emphasized all the qualities I admired about him, his kindness, intelligence, and sense of humor. Then I gently broached the subject of our physical relationship. I explained that while I understood ED was a medical issue, I was worried about the impact it might have on our long-term compatibility. Josh listened intently, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. When I finished speaking, he thanked me for my honesty. He admitted that he'd been struggling with how to address the elephant in the room. Josh then opened up about his history with ED in a way he hadn't before. Apparently, Josh had been dealing with erectile dysfunction since his early 20s. He'd seen multiple doctors and tried various treatments over the years, but nothing seemed to provide a consistent solution. The issue had taken a major toll on his self-esteem and previous relationships. Josh confessed that he often felt like less of a man because of his inability to perform sexually. Hearing Josh's vulnerability and pain, I felt a wave of empathy wash over me. I realized how much courage it must have taken for him to keep putting himself out there romantically, knowing the challenges he faced. We talked for hours that night, delving deep into our fears, insecurities, and hopes for the future. By the end of our conversation, we both felt emotionally drained but also closer than ever. Josh and I agreed that we cared about each other enough to keep trying to make things work. He promised to be more proactive about exploring treatment options, including therapy to address the psychological aspects of his ED. I committed to being patient and supportive as we navigated this challenge together. Over the next couple of weeks, Josh and I focused on building intimacy in non-sexual ways. We had long talks, cuddled while watching movies, and gave each other massages. It was nice to connect physically without the pressure of sex looming over us. I found myself appreciating Josh's gentle touch and the way he always seemed to know when I needed a hug. However, I'd be lying if I said all my doubts disappeared. There were still moments when I wondered if I was setting myself up for disappointment down the road. I couldn't help thinking about Josh's ex who had cheated, and whether I might eventually feel the same frustration she did. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of all the wonderful qualities Josh possessed. As we continued dating, I noticed small positive changes. Josh seemed more relaxed and confident when we were intimate, even if things didn't always go as planned. He started opening up more about his insecurities, which in turn made me feel closer to him. I realized that this journey was bringing us together in unexpected ways. Still, questions lingered in the back of my mind. Could I truly be fulfilled in a relationship where traditional sex might always be a struggle? Was I strong enough to handle the challenges that lay ahead? Only time would tell, but for now, I was cautiously optimistic about our future together. Update 2: It's been about 2 months since my last update, and a lot has happened in that time. Josh and I continued working on our relationship, both emotionally and physically. He started seeing a therapist who specialized in sexual health issues, which seemed to be helping him address some of the psychological aspects of his ED. We also experimented with different approaches to intimacy. We focused on lots of foreplay, and explored ways to pleasure each other that didn't rely solely on penetration. Some attempts were more successful than others, but we always made an effort to keep things light and maintain a sense of humor about it all. Despite our best efforts, I still found myself struggling at times. There were nights when I'd lie awake, wondering if I was fooling myself by thinking this could work long term. I cared deeply for Josh, but the lack of satisfying physical intimacy was starting to wear on me. About a month ago, Josh and I had a breakthrough of sorts. We'd been out to dinner and came back to my place, feeling relaxed and connected. As we started kissing on the couch, things heated up naturally. To both our surprise, Josh was able to maintain an erection without medication. We ended up having sex, and while it wasn't mind-blowing, it felt like a huge step forward. Afterward, Josh was elated. He said he felt more confident than he had in years. I was happy for him and hopeful that maybe we'd turned a corner. However, a small part of me couldn't help but feel that the sex itself had been somewhat lackluster. I pushed that thought aside, not wanting to dampen Josh's excitement. Over the next few weeks, our sex life improved somewhat. Josh was able to get aroused more easily, though maintaining it was still hit or miss. We were intimate more frequently, which was nice, but I found myself wishing for more passion and intensity. Then, about 2 weeks ago, something unexpected happened. I was at a work conference out of town and ran into my ex-boyfriend, Mark, 30M. We'd dated for a year in college and had always had explosive chemistry. Seeing him brought back a flood of memories. Mark and I ended up grabbing drinks to catch up. One drink turned into several, and before I knew it, we were back in my hotel room. The sex was incredible, passionate, intense, and deeply satisfying in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. The next morning, I was overwhelmed with guilt. I'd never cheated on anyone before and couldn't believe I'd done this to Joshua at the same time. Being with Mark had reminded me of what I'd been missing in my physical relationship with Josh. I flew home feeling confused and conflicted. Part of me wanted to confess everything to Josh immediately. Another part wondered if I should end things with him, knowing now that I wasn't fully satisfied. And a small, selfish part considered keeping the affair a secret and potentially seeing Mark again. For the past 2 weeks, I've been grappling with what to do. Josh has noticed that I've been distant and keeps asking if everything is okay. I feel terrible for lying, but I'm paralyzed by indecision. I care about Josh deeply and don't want to hurt him, but I also can't shake the feeling that I deserve a relationship with both emotional and physical fulfillment. I'm at a crossroads and don't know which path to take. The guilt is eating me alive, but so is the fear of potentially giving up a great guy for something as shallow as sexual satisfaction. Any advice on how to proceed would be greatly appreciated. Update 3: It's been a month since my last update, and I'm still reeling from everything that's happened. After weeks of internal struggle, I finally decided to come clean to Josh about my infidelity. I knew it would be painful, but I couldn't continue living with the guilt and deceit. I invited Josh over to my apartment, my heart pounding as I prepared to shatter the trust we'd built. When he arrived, looking concerned about my recent distant behavior, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Taking a deep breath, I launched into my confession. I told Josh everything, about running into Mark at the conference, the drinks, and what happened afterward. I explained how conflicted I'd been feeling about our physical relationship and how the encounter with Mark had brought those feelings to the surface. Throughout my explanation, Josh sat in stunned silence, his face a mix of shock, hurt, and anger. When I finished speaking, the silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Josh spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked if I'd been unhappy all along, if everything we'd built had been a lie. The pain in his eyes was almost unbearable. I tried to explain that it wasn't that simple, that I cared for him deeply but had been struggling with our physical compatibility. Josh listened, but I could see him shutting down emotionally. He stood up abruptly, saying he needed time to process everything. As he left my apartment, I felt a mixture of relief at having told the truth and devastation at the pain I'd caused. For the next week, I didn't hear from Josh. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the guilt and uncertainty. When he finally reached out, it was to say he wanted to meet and talk things through. We met at a neutral location, a quiet park near both our homes. Josh looked tired and defeated, nothing like the cheerful, confident man I'd first met. He told me he'd done a lot of thinking and had come to a difficult decision. While he cared for me, he didn't think he could move past my infidelity. Moreover, he realized that he needed to focus on himself and his own healing before he could be in a healthy relationship. I listened, tears streaming down my face. Despite the pain of the moment, I knew Josh was right. We'd both been trying so hard to make things work that we'd lost sight of our own needs and happiness. As we said our goodbyes, there was a sense of finality that broke my heart but also felt oddly freeing. In the weeks since our breakup, I've done a lot of soul searching. I've realized that while Josh was a wonderful person, our relationship had been built on shaky ground from the start. I'd ignored my own needs and desires, convincing myself that his great personality could overcome our lack of physical chemistry. I've also grappled with my actions and the person I became in this situation. Cheating went against everything I thought I believed in, and I'm still working on forgiving myself. I've started seeing a therapist to work through my feelings and understand why I made the choices I did. As for Mark, I haven't seen or spoken to him since the conference. While the physical connection was undeniable, I recognize that it was born out of my own dissatisfaction and doesn't necessarily mean we'd be compatible in a real relationship. Looking ahead, I'm focusing on healing and growing as a person. I'm learning to be more honest with myself about my needs and desires in a relationship. While the experience with Josh was painful, it taught me valuable lessons about compatibility, communication, and the importance of not settling in matters of the heart. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm committed to being true to myself and my partners moving forward. The road ahead may be uncertain, but I'm hopeful that with time and self-reflection, I'll find a relationship that fulfills me both emotionally and physically.